artificial agent. Usually an electromechanical machine that is guided by a computer program or electronic circuitry. Robots can be autonomous, semi-autonomous or remotely controlled and range from humanoids such as Asibo and Tokyo to nanorobots. They were not widely adopted as human labor, particularly slave labor, while still inexpensive compared to the capital-intensive machines.
You're my silent lover. Ooh, she's like no other. She lives undercover. Tonight, oh, you're my silent lover. Whoa, I need your lover. Ooh, come alive. Tonight, whoa. I know you're only for a while. You come alive before my eyes. We can't control the way we feel tonight. These neon lights are blinding me. I catch you looking at the sky. We can't control the way we feel tonight. Hey, whoa.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Welcome. I am very excited to be here tonight, and I suspect a few of you are kind of excited too. Welcome to the Nerdery. If you haven't been here before, we are a digital business consultancy. We do work for all kinds of companies, small, medium, large, and you know, our space where we live, where we land, where we kind of love the work that we do, is in building products, things that have a meaningful impact for people out in the world, things that you can tangibly look and say, okay, this is something that's going to actually be transformative, that's going to have an impact, that's going to change the way that people live their lives. And we do that for businesses all over. We do it for internal products, and we also do it for things that live in the consumer space. And it's really exciting for us when we get this chance to engage in conversations like this, like the one we're having with Jared. You know, I'll hand it over to Christopher pretty quickly, but I can tell you that, like, from my perspective, it's been kind of fun to have Jared here and to be able to watch some of our designers walk around all, like, giddy and starstruck. that's been kind of, I think, like my happy space. And so it's been really exciting that we can start there. And just to get things off, I'm going to hand things over to Mr. Christopher Steffen to introduce and talk a little bit more about Jared.
Thank you, everyone. I promise not to keep you for too long. My name is Christopher Steffen. I'm the Research and Testing Domain Lead here at the Nerdery in our Experience Design Department. I'd like to thank all of you for coming here for the Jared Spool is Coming to Town Preparedness Test. You can all go home now. No, actually, I'm not that cruel, although I did study psychology once. I would like to introduce Jared Spool, who, apart from just being the founder of UIE, biggest usability organization of its type, or of any type really in the country, a luminary who kind of shares a platform with other thought leaders in our industry, who basically lifts up their voices and lets their content and their thought percolate throughout our industry. I'm pleased to have him here to speak to you. I want to hear him too, so I'm going to sit down and shut up right now. This is Jared Spool.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Hi. Hey. I'm internet sensation and teen idol Jared Spool. Putting on an event like this, having the nice spread, putting out all the seats, which, by the way, there are seats here if you want to go find them. If you're sitting next to an empty seat, raise your hand. Okay, see? Lots of seats. Go. Putting these things on takes a lot of work. Let's make some noise for the folks at the Nerdery for hosting this. Excellent. So I want to go back to a very specific moment in time, particularly 8:08 in the morning on January 14th of this year, when suddenly the 1.4 million residents and visitors to Hawaii had their phone display this message, or it was there for a minute. Where'd it go, Matt? I don't know where it went. Let's try this again. Hello? There we go. Is it going to stay? It's going to stay. Okay, excellent. So, of course, this is probably now the second most famous emergency alert. The last one was a drill, but I'm really afraid of what it was a drill for. But this one turns out to sort of put a whole lot of things into motion. One of the things it put into motion is the fact that it's a little known fact, but one of the jobs that we do at UIE is we do a lot of basically what we call UX forensics, where people call us in to figure out why something happened and what the user experience issues were. So this, knowing that we would get reporters calling us and all sorts of other folks sort of jumping through hoops, we immediately started to take this apart. And the method that we do is we look, of course, at why. And we're trying to figure out what the root cause is. Now, a lot of people who do root cause analysis use a technique that you've probably heard of known as the 5 whys. The 5 whys is basically you just keep asking why to get to a particular answer. But the thing about the 5 whys is that it drives you down a singular line of thinking, and it doesn't allow other potential contributions that might branch off to actually be considered. So we do something different in our work, which is called a fishbone analysis. And in a fishbone analysis, you start with the problem, in this case, suddenly everybody gets an alert, and you try and figure out what all the different causes could be. And it's called a fishbone because these then have divisions off of them, and it sort of looks like the bones of a fish after you've taken the fish part out. And so we started to take this apart. Now, within 24 hours, we started to have some substantial evidence as to what was going on. The first was a tweet that featured this screen, which was the menu screen that had all of the different types of alerts. And the going theory that was popular at the time was that if you look closely, you'll see that there's this thing that says PACOM CDW state only and drill PACOM CDW state only, that this was the one that they had meant to click on, but somehow they accidentally clicked on this. PACOM stands for Pacific Air Command. It is the Air Force setup for the drill. Now, the governor's office put out their own tweet for some reason, saying that this was a complete lie, this wasn't the menu, this was the menu. Well, that cleared that up. And of course, there was all sorts of criticism that, you know, who would create in this day and age menus that were this bad, this is obviously bad thing. And there were all sorts of theories that started to float about. So, for example, there was the theory that the menu itself was poorly designed. There was a theory that somehow or other these alerts were sent out without any password that was required. That there was no confirmation, you know, something would pop up and say, you're about to notify 1.4 million people. Do you really want to continue? That the drill and the actual real message were contained in the same tool and not somehow separated in a different sandbox, and that, you know, people were saying, well, it's QA 101 that you test on a test server in a different sandbox, and you would never be able to send something out to 1.4 million people. That, you know, there was no, one of my favorites, there's no way you could, built into the system to cancel a message. Right? There was no procedure for canceling a message. Like, you know, once it goes out and buzzes everybody's phone, you press an oops button, it's like, oh, take that back. Right? And turns out that none of this was actually true. We found out within about 48 hours that the system that they had been talking about using was this system from something called My State USA, which is one of the vendors that makes emergency alert software. And they had, the state of Hawaii Emergency Management Services had actually put together a demo video showing how they send out an alert, usually for tsunamis or Amber Alerts. Those are the things they're mostly concerned about. And they walk through the process of using this software. And it turns out that My State USA had been acquired by a company called AlertSense, and this was actually the software that they were using, was AlertSense. And it turns out that, in fact, these are the menus for AlertSense. This is a menu that shows up in a pull-down, and this is a menu that shows up in a, when you just ask to look at all the files, because it's a web-based file system. It's like, show me all the files you have. This is the listing of all the files. And there are two different ways to get access to this, and both of them are legit. Both of them are there. And so it turns out that we had a theory at the time, at this point, our going theory was that the reason that it was sent out by accident, first, the time, 8:08, was very significant because emergency management operation centers tend to work in 8-hour shifts. So there's one that starts at midnight, there's one that starts at 8, and there's another one that starts at 4 o'clock, right? So, and the first thing you do as part of standard procedure is you run through your drills, partially to make sure that you have all the things like the passwords necessary. AlertSense, in fact, does require a password to send something out. But one of the things about the way a drill works is that you want to practice exactly what you are going to do. Right? When you do a fire drill, the whole idea is to actually leave the building, not get in a different building and pretend to leave it. But to leave the building you're in, and then if you're actually being very diligent about the drill, you do some sort of retrospective or post-mortem on the drill and say, well, did people, for instance, stop to pack up all their stuff, or did they just leave their stuff and leave the building? Can we give them the right information? Well, that's what you do in a drill. So part of the exercise of starting a shift is to do a series of drills. So we thought that that, in fact, could have been what was going on here, and that what happened, the going theory we had within about the first week, was that that there is a problem that is known in file systems, it happens all the time, when you accidentally call up the wrong file. That they clicked on the PACOM CDW state-only file when they meant to click on the drill file, not because they shouldn't be in the same place, but because these are user-defined file names. And user-defined file names is actually an age-old UX problem, or UI problem, however you want to consider it. When we let people name things, we lose track of where they are. This is why, as designers, we often have file names that say revision A.1.2-final-really final. And it would not be unusual for us to call up the A.1.2.final and think we're working with the final when in fact it's not the really final, and someone says, well, wait a second, that's not the really final. Well, I didn't know about the really final, right? And this happens all the time. So it wasn't that the software was problematic, it was the actual naming of what are called the templates. And you can sort of see, it's a little hard to see on this screen, but there's the bottom of a word that's hanging off the top of the screen there, and that word is templates. And templates are what in the emergency systems, those are called, these individual files are called templates. The idea being that you bring up a template, you type the actual information into it that you know about, and then you send it off to folks. And so we thought at this point that they just opened the wrong template, because how many times have you opened a file thinking it was the most recent and actually saved over some real work? It's a common problem, and we've never solved this problem in the 40 years that we've had file systems on computers. We've never actually bothered to try to solve this problem. But it turns out we were wrong. We were wrong because it came out that, in fact, it wasn't an accident. It was intentional. That the worker actually thought there was a missile coming their way. Now, the sequence of events that got to that point, they did nicely throw the employee under the bus and claim that, well, they weren't that great an employee and we're going to get rid of them. But it turns out that what actually happened was the supervisor from the previous shift, the midnight to 8 a.m. shift, decided that they were going to run an unscheduled drill. And as soon as their shift ended, they went into a conference room, they picked up the phone, and they called into the center as if they were Pacific Command. They started the call with, this is an exercise, this is an exercise, this is an exercise. But that was only heard by the person who'd picked up the call, who then put it on speaker, and then the person ran through the procedure for it not being an exercise, including using the words, this is not a drill. And the person in the room who did not know it was an exercise, who typed in that message, it turns out that there's about 15 different things that have to happen in the case of an emergency. That person was the one who sent out the message, and that person, unfortunately, was the one who got fired. And so now we have another alternate cause here, which is the user didn't understand it was a drill. Now keep in mind, all these other things, they're actually worth consideration, right? Some of them are factually incorrect, but they are all the types of problems that we need to sort of think about when we're designing big systems like this. So while we now know that it was an intentional thing, the template problem, should we have passwords, which we did? Should we have confirmations? Well, that's sort of impossible. There is a confirmation that says, do you really want to do this? But you always say yes. Not sure that, it's like, there's a fire, do you want to leave the building? Yes, okay, we'll leave. So that's it. And at this point, I thought the thing was settled. And we got a call from NPR. And the writer at the time, a guy named Martin Cast, called us and said, I want to talk to you about what happened. And so I was going to walk through that diagram with him, but he wasn't the least bit interested in that. He was actually more interested in the software that they used, AlertSense, and who made that software, and why isn't the federal government making this software? Why are we letting software vendors create software for these emergency systems? And I tried to explain to him, and I have spent a year in the federal government working in the U.S. Digital Service in the White House, so I know how software is made inside the federal government. I am way more comfortable with it being made by a software vendor. But he was really interested in this, and so he was talking to me, and the next day he was going to talk to the chief engineer at FEMA to understand how this worked, and some people at the FCC, and he really wanted to understand where this software was. And what he finally came around to was something that we hadn't really considered before, which was this idea of whose job is it to actually send out a missile alert? Tsunami warnings make sense for Hawaii to send that out. They're the ones who are most affected. There are other states. But these emergency services systems, they are in every city, county, and state. You've gotten Amber Alerts before. You've now gotten one from the president, or maybe you were lucky and you didn't. And who gets to decide that this is a big enough problem that we are going to send this out? And when he started talking to the feds said, yeah, actually it's not our job to alert somebody that a missile is heading this way. That in fact that job belongs to the states themselves, and the states then get into the software and their emergency operations centers kick into gear. And what was fascinating about this was the head of emergency management for Harris County, he was like completely shocked that this was his job. Harris County is one of the largest counties in Texas, and he's like, how am I supposed to know if a missile is coming? who's going to tell me that? How do I verify it's true? And what does that actually mean? So now we have this new thing, which is that there was no clear authority. And that sort of stuck with me, this idea that there's no clear authority. So we started to do more research into this. Now, it turns out that the state of Hawaii in November of 2017 had actually revised their emergency preparedness plan. And this was as a direct response to the President of the United States talking about the size of his buttons. And North Korea launching test rockets. And at the time, the folks in Hawaii knew that if North Korea was going to try and land something on the soil of the United States, Hawaii was in fact a very likely target, being that it's the closest and the easiest for them to get something to. And they started to put together an emergency management plan. And if you read the plan, they go into great detail about what a missile coming from North Korea means and how they react. So a missile gets launched from North Korea. And in the first 5 minutes, the Joint Operations Center of U.S. Pacific Command verifies that this missile has been launched. They're able to do this, by the way, because of troops that we have in South Korea. If we remove those troops for South Korea, this gets moved from 5 minutes to 15 minutes, just pointing that out. The next organization to kick into gear is what's called the Hawaii State Warning Point. They have 5 minutes to actually put their emergency plan into operation. This is the center of the emergency management system in Hawaii. This then gets translated into messages that get sent out, and individuals on the island of Hawaii, on the islands of Hawaii, 1.4 individuals, have to find shelter. They have to clear out of the highway so that emergency vehicles can get through, and they have to tune into some place where they can stay tuned to what's going on. They get 10 minutes to do that, because it's a whopping 20 minutes from the moment the missile takes off to when it lands in Hawaii. Now, keep in mind that even though we can detect a missile launch, we do not know what's in that missile. We do not know if it's just the shell of a missile. We do not know if there's a conventional warhead, nor do we know if there's a nuclear warhead. But what we do know is it will take 20 minutes, no longer, to get from North Korea to Hawaii. 20 minutes to save 1.4 million people. That's the trouble that the Hawaii emergency management people are dealing with. So, this is the question, right? If you only have 18 minutes, how do you design a system that saves 1.4 million people's lives? I just remembered, Matt, I have audio in this presentation.
This station is conducting a test of the emergency broadcasting system. This is only a test.
So this is the original emergency management system, emergency broadcasting system. This was created in the early 1960s as a system to alert the population in the event of a nuclear attack. And the tones you hear, there are two of them that are played simultaneously. Those two tones are actually used to turn on this machine. This is a teletype machine. And there are special receivers that listen to the radio for those two tones. They are literally tuned into a radio station with the intent that when that radio station plays those tones, it then activates this device, which then collects information from a different television or radio station, which has forwarded it to this station, and then this station plays those two tones for the next station. It's basically a giant phone tree calling one system to the next. And that system existed until the 1990s, when it was replaced by this system. This is iPause. And iPause is the system that got tested a few weeks ago. It is the emergency system that controls all of the different elements that happen, from signs, the street signs that happen out there, to things that happen on the TV, to your phone buzzing, to a variety of state alerting systems. And the design of iPause is that there are different authorities who can trigger an alert, which makes perfect sense. If you have localized flooding here in Minneapolis, you don't want to wait for the feds to trigger that alert. You want the local authorities to be able to say, hey, the highway is flooded, don't go on the highway. You want to get the signs lit up, you want to get people's phones to tell them to go in a different direction, and you only want to do that within that one region. Well, that means every authority has to have some way of triggering that, and to do that, the folks at DHS in the FEMA group authorize 23 different software vendors to create software to an API specification that actually can send messages through the system. And AlertSense is one of the 23 different alert origination software providers that are allowed to do this. So if we start thinking about, okay, what does this landscape look like? We've got the Hawaii State Warning Point. Those were the folks who sent out the actual alert. They actually work for a Hawaii Emergency Management Agency. We have US PATCOM, which is the one who's detecting the launch of the missile. We also have FEMA, which is the folks who put together the emergency system to begin with. And we have the FCC, who own all the communications portion of the emergency management system that we are now familiar with. And then we have 23 different alert or origination software providers. Now let's talk about design. Who owns the design of this system? Right? Well, to do that, we have to sort of talk about, well, what is design? Design, the best definition I've come across is design is the rendering of intent. A designer has an intention in the world, and they use their designy skills to make that intention real in the world. They render it. Okay. Of this great group of people, who's responsible for choosing the intention? Seems like FEMA and FCC, who own iPause, should be, but they actually want to back away and give it to the states. The states sort of want to do it, but they're at the mercy of the origination software vendors. Who owns the intent? Well, we have a word for this. We've had it for a while. We call it governance. Governance is who owns the intent. And the question that really sort of jumped out at us when we started to look into this is a big problem. This is not just about the emergency management system. This is a much bigger problem, which is when you have multiple organizations, who owns intent? That turns out to be a huge question. This is Ray and Charles Eames. They were amazing designers. You have seen their work a million times. One of the things that you may have seen, probably in grade school, was a movie that they made in 1968, commissioned by IBM, called The Powers of 10. And Powers of 10 was this beautiful 7-minute film. You can find it on YouTube. I highly recommend you look it up. And it's this idea that we can reframe things. So the way the movie works is it starts with a camera 10 meters above this lovely couple lying down in a park. And then the camera pulls back 10 meters. And remember, they did this in '68 before there was any computer animation. So they did this all with really clever photography. And the camera pulls back, and now you see a much larger piece of the park from now 100 meters out. And then they pull back again by another power of 10. And we can now see parts of Chicago, the marina area of Lake Michigan. And then they pull out again, and we're now 10,000 meters out, and we can see that we are at a place of on that sort of part of the United States. They keep pulling the camera out. Eventually, we get to 1,000,000 meters out, and at 1,000,000 meters, we're now seeing the entire planet. And eventually, they pull out far enough to see the whole Milky Way galaxy at 10 million, 100 million light years, and 100,000 light years. And the idea is that they just keep pulling it out. And then they zoom the camera back in, and they go microscopic. And like I said, it's really a delightful film. It's particularly delightful if you think about how they pulled it off. And it'll be a good use of 7 minutes of your life. You'll be happy for it. But the reason that I talk about this is that I was fascinated by each of these levels. One of the things that fascinate me is that the tools we need to use to see each of these levels changes depending on the level of resolution that we're talking about. When we're just 10 meters above, we might use a tool like this, but if we want to see something that involves about 1,000 meters out, we have to look at this, and if we want to go 100,000 meters out, we have to look at this, and if we want to look at hundreds of thousands of light years, we have to look at this. Each of these tools are telescopes. Each one does basically the same thing, but because of the nature of the resolution, we have to use a different tool to get there. And this idea that we need different tools for each resolution really sort of resonated with me. And we can sort of take this apart even further, and we can look at a particular problem. Let's look at the problem of pollution. In the problem of pollution, if we're just focused on that park level stuff, the problem of pollution in a park is usually around litter, right? So how do we solve that problem? Well, we put out trash cans and we let people pick up after themselves. If we're looking at the resolution of a city, well, now we have to deal with landfill management and how we do trash collection. And the problems are very different that we're dealing with at the city resolution than if we're dealing at the park resolution. If we want to look at a planetary resolution, well, now we're dealing with climate change, something that I am still of the belief exists. And the types of solutions that we need to apply to climate change are very different than landfill management and trash collection or litter management. And similarly, if we pull back again and we start to look at space, well, now we've got the issue of space junk that is floating around our planet, millions and millions of pieces of space trash that are moving at 17,000 miles per hour and can do massive damage to anything that you put into orbit. And so these things become problems. So at every different resolution, we have different problems. And at every different resolution, we have to have different solutions. So now if design is the rendering of intent, this means that at every level of resolution, our intentions have to change. We have to have a different understanding of the intentions. And the rendering has to change. We can't use the same rendering if we're just dealing with the park level resolution than we do if we're dealing with climate change. We have to actually change that. But the idea that design is the rendering of intent, that doesn't change. The sole nature of design remains the same. It's just what the intention is and how we render it that we have to change. When I started in this business, back in the late 70s, early 80s, we got very, very excited by this book. This was a 263-page book written by Sid Smith and Jane Mosier. It was affectionately known by those of us in the biz as Smith and Mosier. It was commissioned by the Air Force. Your tax dollars paid for this. And what it was a document of every best practice screen design pattern that Sid and Jane could find, research-based, for designing systems. The Air Force commissioned this because they were producing all these computer systems now, and they were running into all sorts of usability issues, and they were having all sorts of inconsistency issues. And the military, being the military, wanted to standardize everything. So they decided they were going to standardize with this document. This was the original style guide. And this was what we were style guiding. This was the state-of-the-art technology. This is an IBM 3270 display, and it produced something known as a green screen. And green screens were, at the time, being designed by lots of different people, all different ways. We've seen this play out many, many times throughout the history of design. And the users were getting frustrated that there were so many different ways of interacting when you move from one screen to the next, from one app to the next. So they wanted to standardize on this. And each page of Smith and Mosier looked like this. It had all of the, and you can go online and see the whole book. It's still there. And it had detailed descriptions with good examples and bad examples of how to do every possible type of data entry and data display on a green screen that you could imagine happening. And they worked up 5 basic principles that described what you should do. You should have consistency in data entry transactions, minimal input actions by the user, minimal memory load on the users, compatibility of data with the data display, flexibility for user control and of data entry. And here's the amazing thing. Here we are now, right? 34 years later from the publication of this book, and these principles still work. They still are right. Of course we want to do this. None of this needs to be adapted. They started with these screens, but everything they did applied to screens that looked like this, and screens that now look like this. Their work doesn't change. It still is relevant. But it's only relevant for screens. It's the tool, it's the telescope we use for the screen. Right? So we can think of the screen as a level of resolution in experience design. We can think of it as the sort of the place where we do user interface work. And over the years, we've developed all sorts of tools that are specific to this type of user interface work. Components and guidelines, usability testing. By the way, it's usability testing, not user testing. Please, if you want to piss me off, just say user testing in front of me. That just gets me going. We don't test the users, we test the design. It's not user testing, it's usability testing. And heuristics. The beauty of heuristics is there are so many to choose from. And that's screen level design. But when computing power got cheap, we moved away from what were called dumb terminals and ended up having processing power on our own desks and then again in our own pockets. We moved to a place where we had to think beyond just the screen. We had to start connecting screens together and start thinking about those designs as coherent units, starting to figure out, well, how do we move from one screen to the next? Or on a given website, how do we organize the information in a way that people understand? Or what is the sort of business flow that happens as we go? And this is very different than the Smith and Mosier rules of how you display information on each screen. Each of the panels, each of the boxes would still apply to Smith and Mosier, but there was nothing in Smith and Mosier that helped us connect these screens together. That required a different set of tools. Now we're at a different resolution, and our focus here is on information architecture and what we typically refer to now as UX design. And the tools that we need are very different. We have wireframes and sitemaps and card sorts and more holistic user research. It doesn't invalidate the other resolution. The other resolution is still there. The tools are still necessary. We just have to have both. And the best designers know how to work at both resolutions. And they can zoom into the design of the individual screens and apply the principles there, use the tools there, and then zoom back out and work on the application-wide, site-wide design. And then more recently, we've now started thinking, well, okay, but the digital thing, it's part of a bigger experience that users have. So we need to start thinking in terms of what is the blueprint of how the digital thing fits into the wider experience. And so we create various types of service blueprints and flow maps and stakeholder charts. And now we're working at a resolution that is organizational wide. That's, in essence, what service design has been about, is this notion of organization. And there are all these conversations that we have all the time about, is it UI or is it UX? Or is it service design? Does service design include UX? I mean, we get into all these discussions as to who owns what, when really what we're talking about are different resolutions that have different sets of tools, and they all coexist. It's like, oh, I'm a service designer, I'm not a UI designer. Well, that can't really work. Because at some point in service design, you're going to have to get down to a screen. And that screen better follow the rules in Smith and Mosier. And you say, well, I'm a UI designer, I'm not a service designer. That can't work either, because that screen has to exist in an organization. It has to understand everything. So we cannot claim that I am one or the other. So you are no longer allowed to argue with the people who post ads that say UX, UI. And at this resolution, we have user journeys and design systems and ethnographic research and this thing we call design thinking, whatever the hell that is. And so, what's interesting about these resolutions, this sort of Eames-like zooming out into what we do, is that it played directly into the missile alert. Because if we pay close attention to the sequence of conversations, the first conversations were all about screen level resolution. How could we have those menus? How come there wasn't a confirmation? All the things in Smith and Mosier. The second set of things were all about application level issues. The third set was all about organization issues. Except for one. There was one problem, one root cause that was just sitting there. What the hell was it? So we named it. We call it ecosystem-wide. An ecosystem has to do with this idea of multiple organizations, designing across multiple organizations. Whereas service design is designing within an organization, ecosystems are designing across multiple organizations. And it too has to have its own set of tools. But I have no idea what they are. But this is the frontier. This is the unexplored part of experience design. I started when the frontier was screen design. I was in this business when the frontier became application-wide or site-wide design. Wrote books on it. I was here when we started to talk about service design. I've been through this before. I recognize what we're doing. We are at that stage again. This is new. And it's everywhere. Right? Because when we start to look at the endemic problems that we are trying to deal with, those endemic problems are ecosystem problems. Is it Facebook's fault that Cambridge Analytica could figure out a way to game their system to be able to get access, to be able to sway an election? The issues we deal with in healthcare have to do with the fact that we have insurers and we have government and we have employers and we have all these different people and hospitals and doctors. They're all different organizations. Who owns the healthcare problem? Right? Who owns it? Where's the governance? What are the tools we even bring to bear on this? So, we've gotten to the point where we're getting a handle on this organizational-wide stuff. But it's the ecosystem stuff that are our next challenges. One of the things that we noticed as soon as we started to think about these models is that what happens, the sequence of events, is that we're dealing at the resolution, we're dealing with the screen, or we're dealing with the application, or whatever resolution, and we start to solve a lot of the problems. We come up with techniques, we come up with methods, we figure out how to solve them, and as soon as we solve them, we realize the problems themselves aren't going away. there are bigger problems that we've never had a chance to see before because we were focused on the problems of that resolution. And that starts to focus us on the next higher up resolution. Every time we start to really get a handle about a given resolution, we realize that it's the next resolution that's holding us back. So who's going to solve this? Well, this is Ariel Kennan. Ariel Kennan, last year, was working for the New York City Mayor's Office of Opportunity. And her challenge at the Mayor's Office of Opportunity was to figure out how to create new systems to support the 45 different New York agencies that dealt with homelessness. And she made amazing progress to bring together those 45 agencies. Again, no real center of governance, to get them to work together to create systems. This was a problem where if you were a homeless person who was getting psychiatric help in Brooklyn and you wandered into the Bronx people had no way of figuring out that you were already getting psychiatric help in Brooklyn. The systems didn't talk to each other. They were mostly on paper. She and her team started building tools to allow the different boroughs and the different agencies within the boroughs to talk to each other, to actually be able to tell who needed what. So if you wandered from Brooklyn into the Bronx, they could give you continuous care. This is another woman I had an opportunity to work with. Her name is Tracy Walker. She worked with me in the U.S. Digital Service. She worked on probably the biggest problem we had to work with in government in the Digital Service, and that was the problem of procurement. If you want to get better systems built in agencies, you've got to hire people who can build them. Procurement in the federal government for software services is done the exact same way, or was until Tracy got there, this exact same way that it was done for building a battleship. There is nothing more waterfall than building a battleship. And the government didn't know how to build anything else. Until the digital service people showed up in the federal government, there were no federal employees with technical experience. Federal employees are all project managers. They hire contractors who have the technical experience, but they specify contracts which go through a procurement process. Tracy, almost single-handedly with a small team, led the charge under President Obama to redesign procurement, redoing what's known as the Technology Federal Acquisition Rules, also known as TECFAR, to actually teach thousands of contracting officers in the federal government how to hire agile teams. This is Dana Chisnell. Dana also worked with us at the Digital Service, and she has since gone on to work at the Harvard Kennedy School of Public Policy. The students at the School of Public Policy are future policymakers in the School of Government. She teaches the one and only design research course in the School of Government. She teaches them how to research policy, how to design and research policy. If you're going to create policy, most policy is built without any real user research. She is single-handedly changing that. Taking brand new policymakers, sending them out to do projects They say things to her like, so are you going to give us the data set for us to work with? She goes, no. You're doing research. You get your own data set. Right? Teaching them to actually talk to the people for which the policies will affect in terms of setting it. This is a whole new novel approach to policy creation. Now, what's interesting about Ariel and Tracy and Dana is that none of them are working at the screen or application level. They are working at the organization and ecosystem level, because that's where the hard problems are. Dana doesn't teach anybody how to design screens in her course. Tracy doesn't work on how do you hire people with screens. Ariel was not concerned about screens. They were working at this level because that was the level where the problems exist. And we could call them basically pioneers. They are the first people that I know of who are tackling these problems of these ecosystem-related issues in production environments. Now, to talk about pioneers, we need to talk a little bit about this guy. This is Simon Wardley. If you don't follow Simon Wardley, you should. He's one of the more brilliant people on the planet. And one of the things that he talks about, which I find absolutely intoxicating, is this idea that there are three types of people: pioneers, settlers, and town planners. Now, pioneers are the people who get into a resolution first. They're the ones who explore it for the very first time. They basically create maps of what that landscape is. They're the ones who are sort of defining what the edges are and figuring that out. Settlers, on the other hand, they come in after the pioneers. Now, the pioneers have to be absolutely brilliant people because they're off doing things that no one's ever done before. The settlers, they also have to be brilliant people because their job is to actually take that resolution that the pioneers have defined and figure out how to make it productive, how to make it effective, how to actually produce consistent outcomes. Their job is to create those initial practices that we all use. The settlers and the pioneers have to be brilliant. So do the town planners, because the planners come in after the settlers, and they're the ones who bring it to scale. They're the ones who build systems, processes, tools, practices that we use, right? All this discussion now about design systems and design ops, this is all town planner shit. That's what we're talking about now, is this idea of scale. How do we scale this to larger organizations? Back when I started working on screens, we didn't care about scale. We were trying to figure out how to get pixels to display. If you think I'm kidding, I'm not. I worked on one of the very first word processors. I was a software developer on that project. I had to write hundreds of lines of code to detect when a key was pressed on the keyboard, to figure out which key it was, to get the bitmap array for the font that I was going to use, to put that character on the screen. If that character pushed other characters to the right, I had to write the word processing algorithm that would actually float text down the screen such that word wrap would happen as we expected. Today's developers don't have to do that. They just bring up a widget that's already built into the operating system, and it does it for them. If we wanted the text to scroll, we had to create our own scroll bar. We had to figure out the algorithms for the scroll bar. And by the way, scroll bar algorithms are not easy. And I estimate on this planet right now, there are only 7 people left who know what they are. That was pioneering work. Planners just bring up pattern libraries with components already built, and it works. We can go back and we can sort of look at the timeline of all of this and say, you know, here's where these things started to appear, and what we're realizing here is that we can see the patterns of when pioneers, settlers, and planners started to really kick in. And there is a progression. There was a progression in the 70s when the pioneers showed up at the screen resolution. It was more in the 80s at the application level. It was more in the 90s for the organization level. And we're only just now talking about how to scale service design. So the ecosystem pioneers, they're just showing up. We haven't seen who the settlers are, what they're going to do, what the planners are going to be like for that. So we need to understand, where are those people going to come from? What are we going to, who we're going to recruit, who we're going to train, what's the process of building all that out? I get in trouble a lot. A few months ago, I got in trouble with a tweet. I suggested that anyone who influences design is a designer. A bunch of people agreed with me. A lot of people got pissed off at this idea. That caused me to say it more. My friend Sarah Brooks suggested the last time I said it that I need to put out a trigger warning, because it really sets a bunch of people off. I get all this crap, right? Does that mean if I add extra mayo to my burger, I'm now a chef? Does that mean that if I put a Band-Aid on, I'm a doctor? No, but you are a designer. You just designed a burger, you designed a medical experience. Not everyone's a chef, and to be a chef, you have to be paid to work in a restaurant. If you're not paid to work in a restaurant, you're just a cook. To be a doctor, you're licensed by the state to be a doctor. If you say you're a doctor and you don't have your license, you'll be arrested. But you could be a designer. What Tracy was doing was she was teaching procurement officers design. She never used the word design, but there was an intent, and she was teaching the contracting officers how to render that intent. What Dana is doing is teaching policy people how to render intent. All these people are designers. Everyone is a designer. Not everyone is a good designer. But everyone can be a better designer. It's actually our job to make everyone a better designer. That's what our real job is. And when we think of each of these resolutions, we have to think about, well, what are the skills necessary? There's this notion called a T-shaped person. This has been around for a while. The folks at IDEO have been pushing, as David Kelly has been pushing this pretty hard. This idea that what you want on your team is a bunch of people who look just like this, right? Who have a small amount of breadth, but one thing that they do really well, in this case, information architecture, right? And this person would then work at the application level. Or maybe they're a user interface designer and they work at the screen level. Or maybe they're a service designer and they work at the organization level, right? Or whatever we're going to call people who work at the ecosystem level. But it turns out that this isn't the best way for us to think about this. This actually gets us into trouble because we have a lot of people who can only do one thing well. What we need is not a T, but, for lack of a better name, a broken comb. We need people who have different skills at different lengths. And when we're building out our teams, we need to figure out what all those different skills are, so that as we build out all those things, we have complements. Whereas when we lay these broken combs on top of each other, we've got someone who's good at all the stuff. And what we really want to do is figure out how to bring up people's skills where they're short, and how to take advantage of them to train others where they're deep. When we're talking about spanning resolutions, skills are way more important than roles. We don't need information architects. We don't need user researchers. We don't need service designers. What we need are people who have information architecture skills, people who have user research skills, people who have service design skills, and those could all be the same person. Everyone could be a better designer means that we need to increase those skills for everyone on the team. Because when we have everyone capable of doing all the things, we can tackle the problems of all the resolutions. Whoops, I pressed the wrong button. So we're going to do this again. Here we go. Let me try it this way. There we go. So we have these different resolutions. We now know that there's at least 4 of them. There may be something beyond ecosystem, but we can't see that yet. Just like we couldn't see the ecosystem one when we were focused on the service design of the organization resolution. But it's probably out there. And we now can zoom out and see the design world better. See what the landscape is from a different resolution. And in order, we have to be able to do that if we're really going to design a better world. That's what I came to talk to you about. So, we need to learn how to design across organizational boundaries. We need to understand that we have different problems at every resolution. We now know that ecosystem design, or whatever we'll end up calling it, is that next level of resolution up above service design. And that's where the really hard problems are to tackle. And because of that, we need pioneers, settlers, and town planners to help us understand how to even begin to tackle that space. And that it's design resolutions all the way down. That we as designers can't say, well, I only work here or I only work there. We actually have to grow to be able to work at all those resolutions all the time, because that's what's needed of us. That's what I came to talk to you about. If for some reason you found this to be the least bit interesting, I write about this on UIE.com. Every week we put out an article on some topic related to something in design strategy. You can see it on the site. You can go to Medium, and we publish them there now, or you can get it in your inbox. If you go to UIE.com, you scroll to the bottom of the page, there's a place for you to type in your name and your email address, have it in your inbox. How many people here get our stuff in their inbox? Excellent. The rest of you should be incredibly jealous. So if you want more on this, I would do that. You can find me at jspool@uie.com. Don't forget to connect to me on LinkedIn. And you can follow me on the Twitters where I tweet about design strategy, design hiring, and the amazing customer service habits of the airline industry. And that's what I came to talk to you about. Thank you very much. Do we have time for a few questions? We do. We have time for a few questions. So if there's a way we can bring up the house lights, I don't know if we can do that or not. But
Matt, can you bring up the house lights?
I don't know. Yes, okay. Excellent. Thank you, Matt. So we have this live streaming, so if you can use the microphone, that would be very helpful. Start with Alyssa.
Thanks, Jared, for the talk. Do you have any words to share when working at this next resolution, how to keep from getting overwhelmed by not boiling the proverbial ocean?
I think we're at the ocean level, so I think that's what we need to boil. Actually, it seems to be boiling by itself. How to not get overwhelmed? No, because I think I've been overwhelmed at every other resolution, so I have no good advice on that. I think the biggest thing to know is when you're at the pioneering stage, it's all just sort of overwhelming, right? I mean, just imagine what it must have been like being the first people to step into parts of this country and see some of those landscapes that there are, and just, of course you'd be overwhelmed. Or to sort of walk up to the edge of the Grand Canyon and figure out, okay, how am I going to get over there? Highway 80 didn't exist back then. So that idea of I think you have to be a certain temperament to just sort of say, yeah, we're just going to make stuff up as we go along, is the nature of being a pioneer. Settlers, on the other hand, they're people who like to turn things into something useful, right? So settlers come in after the pioneers, and they let the pioneers be overwhelmed by just the massiveness of the landscape, and they just sort of pick their little farm and they just start working it, right? And they just try and figure out, well, how can I get that farm to be more productive? And so now they're sort of working on that thing that's right there. And then the town planners, they're thinking about scale. They're thinking about, well, how do I create this systems to do this repeatedly and get repeatable outcomes over and over with large numbers of people, some of whom haven't been around and are new to this. And so they have a different set of problems. So I think at each of those sort of scales, you're dealing with a different set of things, and all of it's overwhelming all the time. You just sort of put on your blinders and just plow ahead anyways. I think that's how any of us who were sort of in those settings gets through it. So embrace your inner overwhelmness. That's yes, sir. Oh. We'll go here and then we'll go there.
Oh, hi. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how emerging higher resolutions impact or provide sort of downward pressure on what we're doing at those lower resolution levels. So as ecosystem design emerges, and that's something that becomes more prevalent, how does that change service design? How does that change interface design, et cetera? And is there anything that you could share with us that you think we ought to do to be prepared for those changes at the lower levels of resolutions as new higher levels emerge?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, let's go back to basic screen design. When all you had was a single screen, you didn't have to have navigation, right? And as soon as we moved up to the app level, we had this big problem of navigation, and it didn't fit anything that we had, but we now had to make room for it on the screen, right? And we had to figure out, well, how do we navigate from one screen to the next? And that problem never goes away. I mean, that's what brought us first the hamburger menu and now the new shish kebab menu, right? Those 3 dots. And, which is, just a thinner, leaner version of a hamburger menu. And menu on a stick. And so, that problem of, wow, when we move to the app level, we now have this new thing. And when service design comes out, right, now we have to think about, well, what does a site architecture mean when I'm looking at different types of service? So, for example, how come my airline app doesn't know I'm in their damn airport? Right? It knows I'm talking to their damn Wi-Fi. How is it when I get off the plane in Charlotte, the first thing that comes up isn't, here's how you get to the next gate, and by the way, you have 7 minutes to get there, but it's a 20-minute walk. Because that's Charlotte Airport. And how come it doesn't know that? How come I have to click 6 times to get a map of the airport to figure out where I'm going from here? It should know that. It should know that I'm going to pass the barbecue place in the center core of the airport, that I like barbecue because I get it every other time I go to the airport. It should have placed my order for ribs so that when I get to the gate, I got the damn ribs and I'm getting on the plane. Because I just did a 20-minute walk in 7 minutes. I earned those ribs. So that's service design affecting the navigation of the app. The navigation model should change based on where I am in the service model. But it doesn't, because we're not thinking that way. Just like we had no idea how to do navigation on a phone when all we had were screens, and we had to figure out, oh, well, what if we hide the navigation through an icon that no one will know? Brilliant. So, when my father, who's 89 years old, knows what a hamburger menu is, we have failed. Just saying. He should never have had to learn this in his lifetime. He should be able to have full access to the navigation, just not know that we call it a hamburger menu. That's leakage. Our corporate underpants are showing. So yeah, it happened. So yeah, this ecosystem thing, the governance stuff, it's going to be huge. I'm already seeing it. I spent half an hour last night trying to get the damn Alexa such that when I say light on, it actually turned on the right device in my house. Naming things in an Internet of Things world where you have 50 different vendors who have different naming conventions, some of whom let you change them and some of them decide that you shouldn't be able to change them, right? Creates all sorts of conflict. And I say, turn on the living room light, and she says, I'm sorry, I cannot do that with your speaker. I'm like, I understand that my speaker is called living room because the Sonos will not let me rename it. It only lets me assign a room. So I have a Sonos speaker called living room, and I have a lamp called living room light, and I can't get it to do the right thing, right? We have namespace conflict. Hell, the Alexa is just a verbal, oral command line interface. which, by the way, the principles were documented in Smith and Mosier. So we have this complete intersection of things that's happening all the time, and we're seeing it now. Who governs the namespace for Internet of Things? When you have 500 different devices in your house, who gets to name them? Because if we let the users name them, we have the file naming problem that we have in the emergency alert system. So who's going to decide the naming conventions and propagate a system for that? Who owns that governance? I don't know. That's huge. And it's going to affect us all the way through. We are about to enter even more hell than we have ever been in before. Just to cheer you up.
Hi. Your tweet about how everyone's a designer.
Oh, no, don't you start.
I love that sentiment, but I'm noticing a growing faction of UX designers, more specifically on the West Coast, that are lobbying for certification. Which, me personally speaking, I used to work at General Assembly. I taught a class to help people get into UX design, and I just worry about that causing limitations like what it did in architecture, and how do we prevent UX design from turning into that and becoming more of an elitist profession instead of one that is open and inclusive and one where people can get into more easily.
That ship has sailed. No, certification is definitely going to happen. It's only a matter of when. And it's not going to come from inside the design community. It's going to come from, I believe, state regulators. State regulators are going to decide that someone in a company has to own the user's experience. If we don't do something on our own to protect users, particularly their data, their privacy, all that information, those users are going to vote people into office who are going to then decide who's going to protect it. Now, if it happens at the federal level, which I doubt it will, at least not under this administration, because they don't like rules, then there'll be an agency which decides, so every new piece of software will have to be approved, just like every new drug, just like anything you label as food has to be made compliant, right? I don't think that's going to happen. I think what's going to happen is at the state level, the regulators, the legislators there are going to decide. But the states regulate things different than the feds. Because the states have limited resources, they tend not to create an approval agency. Instead, they do what they did in architecture and they do what they did in environmental services and everything else, which is they license one individual for an organization whose job it is to sign a document that says this thing we are putting out complies with our rules. And if it turns out it doesn't comply with the rules, that person loses their license, gets fined, and potentially goes to jail. So that person is only going to sign something. Oh, and by the way, if the company put something out and that person didn't approve it or badgered them into approving it, someone there goes to jail or gets fined or there's an issue. That's how that works in architecture, it works in environmental services, works in hairdressing. So there is going to be licensing to protect users. Now, people will say, well, as a designer, I don't have the authority for the whole organization. That's going to be someone in product, or that's going to be someone in legal. And that's fine if that's who you want it to be. If we are happy turning the rules over to them and letting them dictate what the users get, seems to me like we're in a good position now to be the ones to actually say how we're going to do that, to put those rules together, to say what it means to protect these folks, and then to be the ones who claim that we should be the ones policing it. Because if we're not the ones policing it, someone else who doesn't know users as well as we do is going to be the ones policing it. We probably don't want that. So yeah, I think that's what we're going to see, and I bet you we're going to see it in the next 10 years. That's the direction we're going. And I think we'll probably see it in a handful of states, California, New York, Maryland would be my first guess. And then many other states will follow suit. And then eventually Texas will do it. Louisiana will never do it. But that's pretty much how I think it'll play out. How are we doing on time?
It is.
Well, I know what time it is, 7:27. How are we doing on your time?
We're okay.
We're okay. Okay.
We've got, I think, one up there.
One up there? Okay.
So I'd sort of like to compare this to your example of building a certain text on a display that developers don't have to worry about anymore because it's automated. Do you think that certain levels of resolution will drop off as we start increasing resolutions and going further? And how do we stay ahead in sort of evolving roles?
Well, I think some of that's true, right? So this is how we make everyone a designer. We give them tools so that good design is the path of least resistance. So when we have built-in components that create good designs without having to do any special effort, then suddenly we are in this situation where we can let anybody just take those components and plug them together and good design emerges. And I think that's what the whole design system movement is trying to do. Design systems are very hot right now because if we can get the design system, the rule is if there's something in the design system that will do what you do, you have to use it. You can't go make your own thing. Use what's in the damn design system. And so that is what the town planners do to make this stuff scale. So yeah, I think that happens at every resolution over time. And we keep building that out. So unfortunately, what that does mean is that there's some knowledge that gets lost, right? Or is only held by a handful of people. We better be damn sure that those tools are going to work for us going forward. I think this is the big problem we have with voice interfaces right now, which is we are reinventing command line interfaces. In order to use Google Home or Alexa or Siri, you have to remember the syntax that they can recognize. You say it just a little bit wrong and they go, I don't know what you're talking about. And that's a command line interface. It just happens to be spoken instead of typed. And you still have to memorize the syntax. We did a lot of research in the 70s on how to create great command lines. Most of us are dead. Y'all have to deal with this thing, and we didn't do a good job of sharing it because we thought, well, who's going to use a command line? That's stupid. We have graphical user interfaces. Well, now we're reinventing them. And at some point, we will have the equivalent of a graphical user interface of a voice interface. I don't know what that will look like. But it will understand, for instance, context. When you say, Alexa, who sang this song? And Alexa tells you, and you say, okay, play that. And Alexa knows that that means the song you were just talking about, and not a song called that. My wife loves voice interfaces. She sits there, we'll have some question we want resolved. I'll whip out my phone and start typing. She'll ask Alexa, I get there faster. Because it takes her 3 or 4 times of Alexa going completely off the rails before she finally gets to whatever the answer is. And so I think that we can't lose things, right? It's a shame that for most of you, you never heard of Smith & Mosier until tonight. That, to me, is a disappointment in our education system. That said, I just graduated students from Center, our school that we built. None of them who know who Smith & Mosier is either, so I'm equally responsible. But that's a problem, right? It's a problem that we don't know our history. And I think that's where we get into trouble. I think that's the problem that we'll have as we start looking at higher and higher resolutions. Where's the other mic?
Right over here.
Hey.
Over there.
Hi there.
Hi.
So I love the themes we're pulling together today about resolution and blurring lines and the broken comb. That all really resonates with me. I'd be curious on your perspective with all that coming together, and some of my struggles I've experienced when building teams is if we're saying this comb exists and people can do all of those things, getting enough UXers in the space to serve it well when they're serving really large teams, and a design system can only scale so far.
Right. So we have to use the support of things like design systems to help get us at the fringes so that those people come along. But we have to decide that everyone's a designer and start treating them that way, and start realizing that everyone we work with, the product managers, the developers, all those people are just broken combs with different tines. And if we can get their design tines to be longer, we can do better. Because right now, as UX people, far too many of us spend far too much of our days taking a single dialog box and drawing out wireframes in 20 different configurations because we have to draw it with the radio button checked and without the radio button checked, and with the fields there and without the fields there, and in the air condition and out of the air condition. And we have to do all that because we can't trust the developers to code it right, so we have to give them every possible thing so they know exactly what to do. How cool would it be if developers understood enough of that type of screen level design that we could draw a thing on a whiteboard and they go, got it, and they go off and the first thing they produce actually is exactly what we wanted, right? If they could do that, we could be working at the higher resolution. But because we keep having to wedge ourselves down at the lower resolutions because we have to draw out those screens at all those levels. I mean, we're just one step above pulling out what we used to do, which is these graph paper grids where you would write the characters in each square of the grid because you had an 80 by 24 display of a fixed width font. And that's how we design screens and turn them over to the programmers. Or, if we were a programmer, that's how we designed the screens for ourselves before we sat down to code, because it was expensive to write code. Those, we have to get beyond that. We have to get there. So the way we're going to do that is by training the people around us to work at the lower resolutions so that we can work at the higher resolutions. We need all of those people. How cool would it be if product managers actually made good decisions? Right? It would be. It would be game-changing. If there are product managers here, you're not included in that list. You obviously made a good decision. You came. But how cool would that be, right? So what we don't have are tools to help the people around us learn the craft of good design, particularly at those lower resolutions, which is well understood. We know how to do that. Hell, we can take someone through GA and put them through in 11 weeks, and they can at least recite something and put out the exact same portfolio as everyone else who goes through GA. We should at least be able to do that with product managers. So we, or developers, all of this stuff should exist, right? They should have these basic skills, and then we can get further. That's the only way I see us scaling this. Over there, yes, sir.
So screens and apps are relatively new, but systems and ecosystems have been around for a long time. Where could we take cues from for now developing ecosystems in this new lens?
Well, I don't think design of ecosystems has been around for a long time. And I'm not sure design of systems has been, systems have always sort of emerged. Systems are very emergent. So when you look at, there is this notion of systems thinking and systems design, but that's fairly new, actually. And the understanding of systems thinking and systems design is a fairly new discipline, new being in the last 20 years. It's very clear we didn't have a very good understanding of systems design because we don't know how to deal with second order effects. We don't know if we pile all the trash up in a park eventually it gets so big that we can't deal with it, and now we have this huge problem of things not even composting because the weight of the trash prevents the compost system from working. You know, we don't understand second order effects of things. And we constantly build systems without paying attention to the downstream effects of how they can happen. So that notion of second order and third order thinking is actually fairly new. And we're just sort of getting our heads around it. So I'm not convinced that those have been around for a while. I think all of the things we have been doing for a really long time, you know, the first screen displays on digital screens happened in the 50s, and non-digital screens, you know, things like paper forms, have existed for much longer than that. The same principles apply to a lot of those things, but Dana Chisnell, one of the other things she works on is elections, and she basically is designing paper ballots and creating paper registration forms and other things like that will be here for a long time. And those principles of form design, those have been around, but no one was applying them to those forms when we were first creating these things. That's why every form is a disaster. That's why, you know, your first day at work, you have to fill out your name 20 different times, and on different forms that do it different ways. Sometimes the last name is first, sometimes the first name is last. You know, it's just weird, right? And it's because there's no coherence, no consistency, and the systems aren't there. So I think the supposition isn't quite right that they're there. Now, that said, there are things we're always learning from larger systems, right? When we see how engineering works, we adapt a lot from engineering. A lot of the vocabulary that we use in design and development is engineering-based language. Architecture also has lots of sort of interlocking systems, and the notion of engineering a building and architecting a building requires independent systems to work together, and we steal a lot from that. Information architecture, software architecture steals a lot from the notions of architecture. You look at the work of people like Christopher Alexander, who created design patterns for architecture and city planning, and we steal a lot in our notion of design systems from the work of people like Christopher Alexander. So I think we're doing it all the time, and as we discover new things, I think, you know, one of the things that we're very good in tech is stealing other people's ideas and claiming they're ours. So I think that happens all the time. But I don't think we're good at any of this. But we're getting better. Over there, one more? Or
last one?
Last one.
Okay. Hi. I'm a front-end developer. It really resonates.
That explains why you're on this side of the room.
Sure. It really resonates with me when you say that we as programmers should really do some of the lifting on design, so that designers can focus on the bigger picture. I've been doing this career for about 6 or 7 years now.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you. I think, though, I've went in a negative trajectory with my regards to design. I used to be very interested in design, and now I think I have grown wary of it. I think on the most benign end, it's something that is modals. But I think on the worst end of it, there's a sort of hollowness and maybe like a little element of like a gentrification and things like that in design, and I'm not too enchanted with it anymore, but you seem very enchanted with it. How could one rediscover their love of that and their faith in the process of design?
That's a good question. I think the thing that helped me the most was the realization that it takes absolutely no skill to suck at something. Anyone can suck at something. They don't have to go to school. They don't have to study it. They can just start doing it, and they'll be really bad at it, and that somehow gives them pleasure. And once I was okay with the fact that that's it, that sort of gave me permission to say, okay, well, if someone tries to do something and they're not very good at it, that's fine. Let's let them do that. And then let's help them get from that point to a place where they actually have some understanding of what the implications are of the decisions that they make. And, you know, there's this sort of philosophy of Sturgeon's law, right? Sturgeon's law, Theodore Sturgeon, the science fiction writer, was once at a science fiction convention, and there was a panel he was on, and someone walked up to the microphone and they said, "Dr. Sturgeon, how come 95% of all science fiction writing is complete crap?" And he thought about that for a second, and he leaned forward into the microphone, and he says, "Well, I think it's because 95% of everything is complete crap." And so Sturgeon's law does kick in, right? I mean, you see it, if you think about all the places in a 10-mile radius of this place that serve food, 95% of them aren't very good, right? There are only a handful that you would consider to be really awesome places. Those are the places you prefer. You ignore the ones that aren't very good. And that's what we do, right? So I think part of my delight is not really paying too much attention to the 95% of crap that's out there, but instead focusing on those folks who sort of break through that and say, okay, how did they do that? What was it they did, and could we teach other people to do that? And over my time of the last 40 years or so being in this field, or having this field grow up around me, you know, people say, well, how'd you get started in UX? I said, I didn't. UX sort of got started around me. In the last 40 years, I've seen us just get better and better and better and better with nobody knowing that they were doing anything different. Because, you know, the pioneers figured out what it was, the settlers came in and created repeatable processes, the town planners came in and said, how do we make that scale? And the next thing you know, we're producing way more software applications than when I started in this field. I mean, if you had an app, when I started, we were really excited when we got our 10,000th user. That was like record breaking. And now 10,000 users is like, you know, you're going to lose your funding. And we're building so many things for so many people now. It's incredible. But at the same time, we haven't shaken things, right? We haven't shaken the fact that we have this mentality that if it works for 80% of the users, that's good enough. But now we have things that have 1 billion, 2 billion users. 80% of the users of 2 billion users, right, means that 20% of the users we're not designing for, 20% of the people who are not getting designed for when we have 2 billion users is 400 million people. We are leaving 400 million people to struggle with the things we build because we say, well, if we get 80%, we're done. We haven't figured out how to deal with that level of scale. So there's still a lot we need to learn. Yeah, I'm an eternal optimist. I believe that we will push through, and we will figure this out. And actually, the act of figuring it out, that's the thing that's most interesting to me. So I like to be there at the front, figuring this stuff out. So I guess that's why I don't get disenchanted, because I'm in the group of pioneers. That's fun for me. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for encouraging my behavior.
Thank you, everyone, for turning out. I hope you enjoyed the conversation tonight. Please drive safe on your way home.